Hi, I'm Jennifer Woosley Saylor. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor and the kid of a cop. And this is the podcast When the Call Hits Home.
Hey everyone, it's Ashlee Gethner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm also a child of a police officer.
Hi, welcome back to When the Call Hits Home. I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Ashlee, and today we have a really special guest. I feel like we say that every time, but every person on here is so special. Like everyone,
Very true.
right? Like so much to the table, and it's always such an honor to have each and every one of these guests come on. So today we have Erin, and I'm going to allow her to introduce herself because I'm going to say resume. I'm just going to go resume here. Her resume is intense and amazing and incredible, and so you guys all have to hear what she's about. So take it away, Erin.
Well, thanks. Thank you for having me. I think this is super cool, and I was really excited when you guys asked, so I'm super excited to be here. Okay, so my resume, let's see. I'll try to Cliff Note version it a little bit. Professionally, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been a social worker in some capacity now for about 21 years. So I always say I actually used my undergrad. So I started in basic needs. I worked with people experiencing housing issues, homelessness issues, healthcare issues, and I did all of that for about 7 or 8 years before I went back and got my master's. I went back to get my master's degree, and my original intention in doing that was to work in hospice and palliative care, end of life, which I ended up doing in my internship and I really loved, but it wasn't clinical work. So I kind of did a 180 in grad school and finished up all of my clinical stuff. And when I graduated, I always say that I had my first, what the heck do I do with my life moment after spending thousands of dollars on grad school.
Absolutely, it's how it
Yeah.
goes, right?
Yep. So I knew that I wanted to go the clinical route, but I didn't know what that looked like. So I just kind of took the first job that came my way. So I ended up as a psychiatric social worker at our Milwaukee County Jail for a couple of years. And I really loved that work. I should get a t-shirt that says, I really loved it, but I would never go back. So,
I have some of those jobs.
yeah. So I did that. I got a really good, well-rounded 2 years of experience with clinical social work there. And then I became a clinician on partnership. It's a collaboration between police officer and mental health clinician. And our team in Milwaukee County is called CART, or Crisis Assessment Response Team. So I worked with a couple different police departments, Milwaukee Police Department, West Dallas Police Department, and then the Milwaukee County DA as well. And that is like I said, it's a partnership. It's a dual response program. So for anybody in mental health crisis, you would get a response from a police officer, but also a mental health clinician. So we would respond to everything from suicidal subjects to delusions and hallucinations to I'm just having a really bad day. So I did that for 5 years.
Wow.
Okay.
So then on the personal side of things, my other hat is that I'm also married to law enforcement. He's a sergeant with Milwaukee Police Department. So when he and I got married and when he and I decided to have a baby, one of us needed a flexible schedule. That wasn't going to be my
You mean the
husband.
police didn't give him a flexible schedule? Come
Once he
on
was a
now.
parent.
Oh, so and at the time when I was working CART, I was working a police schedule. So, but I had it even worse than my husband did because my partnering officers, I worked with different officers, and depending on what officer I worked with, I worked different shifts.
Oh,
So
wow.
I might be working like a day shift one day and like a mid shift the next day and even like a later shift the next day. So I was kind of all over the place. So at least my husband had a set schedule at that time. So when we had our baby, our baby is now 4 years old, we decided that I took 2 months after I came back from maternity leave to try to make it work. And I call it, round hole square peg. Like no matter how I turned it, it just
Right.
wasn't working. So that was where I left. I am now doing, gosh, what am I doing? I think it's really hard to describe. So I'll try to Cliff Note version it. I consider myself a therapist. I am a therapist for first responders in the Southeast Wisconsin area. So I see people for long-term therapy, kind of traditional therapy. I see people for crisis-related work. I respond to critical incidents and OISs, and I do kind of all the things, many hats that we wear when we work with first responders. And then because I thought that I needed more on my plate, probably a couple of years ago, I went into practice with a couple really great friends of mine who ended up being my business partners now too, where we focus on like women and women's health. So I wear multiple hats. And that's kind of where I see more sometimes our first responder spouses too. So
Which is a really good segue into everything, because one of the things in our last episode too, we've been talking about so much is this notion of like spouses and where do they go for their support and what do they do, and that encompasses this, right? Like you working with women, specifically women's health, I've seen it tenfold. Like I'm always like send them to Erin, like they need that help too. But it's so important that we recognize that the spouses also need that support as well, not just the first responders.
yeah, absolutely.
So let me just ask again, first of all, what a very impressive resume. And then I'm going to ask about your personal life.
Yeah.
I do want to come back to the clinical aspect of things, but I do want to say, was there any adjustments it sounds like you kind of had a first responder schedule in that experience, but anything very specific that you noticed in terms of being a spouse of a first responder?
Oh gosh. I think I'm just going to come out and say it. I think one of the things that we don't really prepare for when we're becoming a spouse of a first responder is kind of an ultimate feeling of loneliness. If, they're out there and doing their schedule and doing their thing, and especially when you introduce kids into that relationship, you oftentimes feel like you're kind of on an island a little bit. And like, how do you manage that connection with your spouse when it's, sometimes just a text message? And how do you manage the things that are happening at home and including everybody?
Right.
I remember distinctly a couple years ago, probably around this time, maybe a little bit closer to Christmas, and my husband being really, really impacted and hurt by really, really simple things, but like by not feeling like he was included in the idea of and the gifts, like purchasing the gifts and getting the gifts, putting down all of the lists of the gifts. What are we going to get? And, for me as a spouse, and somebody who needs to kind of manage lots of things in the house, I needed to just function. I needed to just get through, crazy, they're stressful. So, there wasn't a lot of thought of like, I need to include my husband, partly because kind of out of sight, out of mind, but also do you have time to do it?
Right.
Again, kind of loneliness, but also kind of on an island of like, I just need to get it done. And sometimes I might not always I can't always include you in your feelings.
I appreciate
not a thing coming from a therapist.
Well, I think it's different when we're a spouse as opposed to when we're wearing the therapist hat. But I do appreciate you just being so honest about that. I do think that's often an experience that people have in first responders' homes. And you bring up a really good point. I have worked with military members, and they do a great job about deployment and being prepared for deployment and then reintegration and all of those things. They do a fabulous job of that. And what I really hear is like in this first responder life, it's every day. It's the shift. Listen, I've got to get to the store and get these gifts. I love you. I don't want you not to be a part of it, but this stuff's got to get done. Yeah. And with moving schedules, it's really hard to include everybody in that. I really appreciate that point, Erin.
I honestly didn't even, until you said that, right? Like, I didn't think about that. Like, we think so heavily about how is this impacting the spouses, right? Like, my brain didn't stop to think about, well, how do they feel on the other end of that too? Because they're not included. Like, they are the ones missing out essentially on a lot. And so what does that look like for them? So I also very much so appreciate that, because now my brain is like, whoa, actually take that step back and recognize too, right? Like, that first responder is struggling with these things, as simple as that.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even have thought that. You know what I mean? Like, Wouldn't
Yeah.
even cross my mind. So I do greatly appreciate that. But I think you hit it on the head, and a lot of people are going to be able to resonate with the fact of like loneliness for sure
Mhm.
is a heavy feeling.
Yeah. And just kind of overall going through going through life things that sometimes your spouse isn't there for
Mhm.
by
Yeah.
nature of their shift and their schedule and their overtime and things like that. I mean, my pregnancy with my daughter, and now again, my daughter is 4 years old. So I had a COVID baby. She was born September 2020. So I found out I was pregnant with her in January, and then the pandemic hit in March. So I had a couple months of like normal pregnancy experience, which was the first couple months, which was like it was horrible, and I wanted to like vomit every day.
Mhm.
Um, but then I had a COVID baby, and we know this already. Our first responders didn't. They were essential workers. In addition to being pregnant during COVID, but also then husband, a dad that was a first responder, going through those appointments. And I think that was one of the things that I do talk about a lot with some of our spouses is, going to those first ultrasounds without your partner, going to the appointments without your partner, kind of going through that pregnancy without your partner in many ways. And I thankfully had some, because it was COVID, I actually got to do some work from home. So I actually did get to interact with my husband a little bit more, but I think that was a pretty big dynamic too. Like, you have this kind of glorified image of what all of these different life changes and challenges are going to look like for you, but they don't always fit that kind of Hallmark movie cookie cutter world. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask through a spouse's perspective, we've already brought up overtime and things like that. And I know very well the MPD, they could struggle with that, right? Like you can really be working a lot at that department. How as a spouse did you handle that? Like, do you handle that when because it's out of your control, right? But I think that what I've seen naturally as a clinician is spouses being so angry about
mhm,
that and angry then at their significant other, even though that significant other cannot control it. Uh,
yeah.
so what do you like? How did you manage that? Or even if you go clinician route on me here, like any tools or feedback of what you think about all that.
Yeah, you know what? I think out of all of the different things that affected me as an individual when my husband and I got together, and also just overall all of the nuances of first responder life outside of the actual job, that was actually the one thing that I was able to kind of manage okay.
Okay.
And I think part of it was because of my job doing CART.
Mm.
Uh,
Right.
I knew how quickly the day could turn around and you'd be stuck on a call for, I remember so quite a bit of them, especially kind of the later shifts where I was supposed to get off at midnight. And I remember not rolling into my house until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. So I think for me, that was a really easy transition because I knew it. I saw it. I saw it every day. I always say I'm the closest to being a cop I never actually wanted to be.
Right.
But like my office was a squad car. I wore a vest just like my officer partner did. So I lived that life for a little bit. So I think that really helped me recognize that like you aren't going to get off on time. Like one of my partners jokingly said like we always like to go to this same restaurant for lunch if we could grab lunch. And for some reason, it just always happened that every time we would pull up to this restaurant, we would get a call. Like,
Mm.
well, I guess we're not eating lunch and I guess we're not eating there ever again because it's starting to start like we're starting a pattern here. So I got that a little bit just from my own professional experience. So that was really easy. However, I'm going to put my wife and mom hat on again. So this past December, my husband was promoted to sergeant. And so he's been on the job at that time, he was on the job for a little, almost 20 years.
Mm.
And almost our entire dating relationship and our marriage, up until that point, he had been working kind of like a second shift or like a modified second to third. They call them power shifts. And so I had always known like evenings when he was working, he wasn't home, and like
Right.
something that I got used to. We kind of figured it out. So shortly before he got promoted, he had been on the day order or day list for quite a long time. He just never took his day shift hours. And he finally decided, like, this might be my only opportunity to see the light of day. I'm going to take day shift. So in 10 months before he got promoted, he went to day shift. So he was on day shift for 10 months. Almost a 25-year career, day shift for 10 months. That was one of the hardest transitions that I have ever done as a spouse and as a mom co-parenting with a law enforcement officer. I think I thought, like, when he goes to day shift, like, he'll be home at night, he's gonna be home for dinner, we can actually have like this normal, like, semblance of like normal family life. He can help with like bedtimes and things like that. And because of so much overtime, that so often did not happen.
Really?
Those 10 months out of all of the years that we've been together, those 10 months were probably the only time that I ever had like I really hate your job moment.
Mm.
Never home. You're stuck on, so like, you're gone during the day, you're stuck on so much overtime. And when you get home, what you have to offer us is so little that I like, are you even here? So,
Right. Oh my goodness, that is hard, especially when you have those expectations of like, yay, like we can sit down and have dinner together and it just not be that experience. That's really tough.
yeah.
And even with your background of like, I know how this works, and still it can be hard. I appreciate Erin because I think it just gives light. It's hard being a first responder spouse. Like, even when we're got it figured out, even when we know how the sausage is made, it's still a difficult thing to try to navigate.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
So I guess I'll just kind of ask then a clinical question then, because again, some of your work with first responders, what do you see in terms of like some of the needs of first responder families?
Gosh, I think grace.
Now that's beautiful. Well, we all need that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
but let's put that
absolutely.
there for sure.
It's not going to look pretty. It like there is, again, kind of going back to that cookie cutter response. Like, I think family life in general, especially in this day and age, doesn't always look pretty. It's always pretty
No.
messy. Like, we've all got like, we have four human beings that live in our house, and even the 4-year-old is going in opposite directions sometimes. So, family life in general isn't pretty these days, but then you incorporate a profession that takes more than just like a 9 to 5.
Right.
And then it really gets kind of ugly sometimes. So I think just grace for the fit, like, from the community looking in on these families and like, how, like, what are you doing? But also for ourselves, that we're not, the holidays aren't always going to look awesome, and that, that we might have to take 2 cars to the football game because you were able to get 2 hours off, but you have to go into work after that. And, I think just all of the little nuances, just kind of reminding ourselves that like we can do this, but we also have to just let ourselves, I don't know. It kind of sounds, this is pretty clinical, but like, let ourselves grieve what we thought was going to be too.
Yeah, I appreciate that in terms of reflecting about expectations. This is what I wanted. This is what I thought it was going to be, and recognize, oh, we can still feel that. We can feel disappointed. We can feel lonely. But then in that place of like, okay, now what? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Beautifully said. Beautifully
I
said.
think that wraps around to what you just said too. Like, it makes that good point of, in those 10 months, right? Like, for how long everything was consistent in a way. And then all of a sudden that changes. And that happens a lot. That happens a lot within departments. That happens a lot for families. I've heard of, family members getting promoted and then they're on third shift now, and kids struggling to sleep because now all of a sudden their parent, who they're used to being home and putting them to bed, is no longer doing that.
Yeah.
And like how that really can impact the system as a whole. But just like you said, like, I think each time that happens, you go through that process, right? Like, and grieving is a good way to put it, in a sense, right? Of like, now everything's changing again of what I know. And that can happen several times throughout a first responder's career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's incredibly hard.
I mean, for example, so My husband was, again, he's always kind of worked like a second shift or a modified kind of second to third. And so when we had my daughter, he worked that second or modified third. They call it late power. So I think he was working from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. And we, again, I need all these like slogans and t-shirts, but like we managed to make it.
Erin,
Like,
are you going to be our merch gal?
I'm
one
gonna
day?
say, I'm like, oh my gosh, we can make this a thing. Like,
we managed to make it 2.5 years of my daughter's life avoiding daycare, but not without the expense of my husband's sleep. So, you know, sleep wasn't great anyway. You ask an officer to work a second or a third shift and you already know that sleep is going to be an issue, but then you incorporate a newborn into the mix and like it's a recipe for disaster. And we know how important sleep is. Like it's, you know, it is the hormone reset button. Like we need sleep in order to function. And a law enforcement officer especially needs sleep in order to function. But we went the first kind of 2.5 years of my daughter's life with my husband really sacrificing his sleep in order to avoid daycare and in order to avoid, you know, for me, you know, everybody's different, but I really thought that those few years of my daughter's life were really important for us to impact her and not necessarily, you know, daycare and other professionals. But again, because of that, my husband, you know, kind of paid with his sleep. Now we went, you know, now in between all of that, he goes to day shift and now he's back on late power as a sergeant. The difference is though, is that now my daughter is in daycare. Now we thought that it was really important, you know, for her social skills and interactions to go back. So now he's in this place where he doesn't have to worry about it. So that was the one thing when we were transitioning back to a late power shift this time, which is your sleep isn't going to be affected. And like, we're going to do our own thing. Like, we got this. You just work and you go to sleep and wake up when you need to, and you don't have to worry about sleep deprivation. So.
yeah. Oof, that's a crucial topic, sleep. I feel like we could have you back on because I know you do a lot with that too. That could be a whole other episode, right? Of like the sleep and how that impacts us.
So Erin, sleep is something that you talk a lot about.
Yeah. Prioritize.
Well, then, because it's so interesting that you say that. Whenever I interview somebody for the first time in terms of an intake, I always ask about sleep. And I don't think, now I'm going to get on a soapbox. I don't think as a culture, we respect sleep enough.
No.
And then I think on top of that, like you said, when people have high stress jobs, you know, you can't just turn your brain off. Or, you know, when you're not even on the cycle of sleep in terms of you're working during the evening and are trying to sleep when the light's out. So yeah, we'll have to have you back and talk more about sleep because it is imperative.
She kind of skipped on her resume that she does like a ton of trainings and stuff, you know, and she's really good with a lot of different topics. So we are going to have to steal her for more. But one thing that I do know, right? You've mentioned it before, so I'm going to call it out. There's 4 people living in your home. So do you want to give us a little bit of a breakdown on what that looks like? Because I think we've talked about this before, just connecting on this notion of blended families. And it's a really big topic. It's something that I find super important when we're talking about first responder world, because we do know, sadly, right? We do know that divorce rates among first responders are incredibly high. And then we are looking at a lot of blended families, which can be such beautiful things. And then they also come with challenges, right? And so if you don't mind talking a little bit to which you're comfortable about some of that for you and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I became a stepmom before I became a mom. So when my husband and I decided to commit and when we decided to get married, he, along with him, kind of came a little buddy. And I got Zach as my stepson. Gosh, I feel like it's all a blur now, but I think he was probably around 9 or 10 years old at the time when we entered each other's lives. So kind of a challenging time from a child developmental stage, but a brain developmental stage and all of the things, right? But also just a really challenging time to be a stepmom. And to be a stepmom, you know, co-parenting with a first responder who, again, we already know that schedule is not very forgiving. what was it like for me to be a stepmom in general and all the challenges that that comes with, because those also can make you feel like you're on an island sometimes. But then what was it like to be a stepmom, but almost kind of like a stepmom slash mom to a kid with a dad who wasn't always there at, you know, school pickup times and, club drop off times and sports, all the things, all the things.
You're like,
Um,
it's flooding back. It's
it's
all
all
flooding
coming
back.
back to me now. When he got his license and access to a car, that was one of the best days of both of our lives.
Absolutely, right?
So yeah, co-parenting with my 4-year-old with my husband, but co-parenting with my stepson with my husband too. A challenge. Yeah.
Well, you make
Yeah.
a good point. I didn't stop to think about that, right? If we're talking about schedules and everything we have already discussed, and then you became a stepmom, and I think there's rightfully so always some adjustments that happen when new people are enter into lives, and then you have to figure out co-parenting. And I could see that as coming into a family with a police officer, right? Like you had to step up in a lot of ways, I'm sure, to help him be the parent he could be.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And then as you were saying, I was kind of thinking, I don't think every first responder family has this ability, but I think that there's always one of us. Like there's always one of us, whether it's your husband or you as the spouse, who has to have some flexibility in your work schedule. Like it just take first responder out of it. Like there's always got to be one,
True.
right?
Yeah.
Like if there's rigidity in one of our schedules, like I can't get off on time, all of this thing, like the spouse has to step in, especially when there are children involved. And unfortunately, I think in first responder world, that's almost always the spouse that's not the law enforcement officer. When they're off, when they're on vacation, it's great. Like when my husband has 10-day vacations, like he's actually like, he's got like 7 or 8 days right now. I'm like, I'm doing all the things. I'm going to go get a pedicure and I'm going to go do this. I'm going to
Yes.
like
Good.
a
Yes.
girls night and like, oh, you want to connect and you want to have some us. Oh, okay. We'll figure out how to fit that in too.
So fair. That's
Yeah.
so fair.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the responsibility, especially when there is a stepchild involved, to the spouse who is the step parent, it's there's so many different versions of step parenting.
Yeah.
Right.
That step parent, especially in first responder world, doesn't get to hold that stepchild at an arm's length of distance to say, you're not really mine, so I don't really have any responsibility to you. Like as I have responsibility to my husband, I also have responsibility to my stepson too.
Beautifully said, Erin. And I think, more and more just seeing the first responder family instead of seeing a first responder and having more conversations like this. Because what I hear in this is that, we are 4 different individuals in this family, and yet how we function as a family has to be in this way with togetherness, which is, you're my bonus kid. And if you got practice, I'm the adult, I will get you to practice. And, the other aspects of that too, in terms of flexibility and things. So I don't know. I think that's such a great point. And a blended family is not one size fits all, and it looks different for a lot of different people. But I definitely hear that importance of flexibility, especially talking about first responder families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think too, as a step parent, what do you want your boundaries to look like in that role?
Yes.
Especially co-parenting as a step parent with a first responder, there's oftentimes, kind of feelings of like, I don't really have a choice. I have to do these things. But if you have enough and healthy, good, communication with your spouse, like you can still establish boundaries. You can still say like, I'm here and I'm ready to step up and I'm ready to do all of these things as a step parent. And, because I love you and because I respect you and our relationship and our marriage and all the things. But like, here's where I don't feel comfortable. And here's where I do need you to figure out where to step up. Like, I honor your job and I honor your shift and your schedule, but I still need you to step up.
Oof. That's so important.
Very powerful. And I think it's sometimes hard that we feel like we don't have that voice.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think that for sure, Jennifer. Like I think it's getting a little bit better now, but I think like this invisible thing that kind of came on us as spouses when we married first responders said, you're going to run the household, you're going to figure out where the kids go, you're going to do all of these things. And I feel like that in general, again, take first responder out of it. I think, let's just be honest, I think women do actually run the world. So like we have kind of all of these like really invisible weights that we all kind of carry,
Mhm.
but then you throw first responder into it, and you know, in clinical world when we're working with first responders, and this is rather crass, so I apologize, but like, you know, we're going to give them all the reasons as to why they might disassociate and all the reasons why they might have, you know, anger and anxiety and depression and all of that stuff. But then we also say like, but it doesn't give you the excuse to check out. It doesn't give you the excuse to not try. And I think that especially in first responder families too, and co-parenting, that like, I still need you to be a dad. Like it might look different. Your dadding might look different because of your job, but I still need you to be a dad and I still need you to be a husband. What that looks like, we both have to agree to. But like you don't get to just check out.
Yeah. What a great point. What a great point. And I know that you and I, we work a lot together. And so we do say that. Like in our trainings, we do give them 101 reasons, right? To be like,
Mhm.
oh, this is why I do what I do, and this is why. But I think that it's so important, like you're saying, for everyone listening right now to recognize like it's not an excuse. And it's
Mhm.
not an excuse to not go get help. And it's not an excuse to not change things if you need to. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like, and for sure, the cool thing about working with first responders, you guys can agree or disagree, for me at least, is to be honest and open like that. Most of the time, they're open to that, like, hard truth feedback.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would agree with there. It's definitely shoot it to me straight, give it to me. I think with what you're saying in that too, you know, communication, obviously. And I just think, and I talk a lot with clients about this, about really, you have to front load. You know, once we're disassociated, which, you know, it's just a fancy way of saying, like, I have left the building. Like, my body's here, but my brain is a million miles away, is to come to a place and having conversations ahead of time.
Yeah.
You know, this is such a silly metaphor, but knock on wood, I've never been in a building that's caught on fire. I hope that never happens. But if this house catches on fire, I know what to do because I did fire drills with no fire. You know, it's that whole thing of like having these conversations. We are going to have super hard days. We are going to be angry. We're going to be anxious. We're going to be all those things. And so, why don't we have a plan for that? And I love this. Like, you're on vacation. I have to prioritize my self care when you're on vacation, and we will make time for us in that as well. So, I just think that that's important too, to think about. You're right. There's no excuse for that. So, here's what we're going to do. Like, we got to have a plan.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that this is kind of at the, you know, this is at the root of every healthy marriage is communication. But I think
Yes.
communication is so like even like double that when you incorporate one of those adults being a first responder. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and taking the time to communicate effectively. You know, like I mean, I can't tell you how many times that like we end up in knockdown drag out like arguments, not really knockdown drag out. You met my husband, knockdown drag out really just isn't a thing. Um, People don't even understand that he's actually a cop when they see him outside of uniform.
This is true. This
Yeah.
is true. I'm always like, oh, like I love it because I'm like, it's so cool. It's so different.
But we definitely end up in like verbal conflict when, you know, when we forget that communication is really important, you know, and
Yeah.
it can't be just as simple as like, well, I thought you were taking her. No, you're taking her to daycare today, or like there's towels in the dryer to be folded, you know, just all of the little nuances of living together in the same house and communicating that more effectively with each other. So.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you wear so many different hats, which is all incredible. I think people need to know that you are available to them if they do want to talk to you about other things too. But I guess whichever way you want to take this, this is broad. This is really broad. But would there be any like tools or tips or anything else that you want to give or stories you want to share with our listeners in terms of, I guess, whichever role you want to pick, honestly, right? Like that's the cool thing about you is you have so many that you get to kind of pick what you want to share.
I think one of the things that I like it's like the umbrella. It's the thing every time I think about like co-parenting with a first responder, it's the thing that I always keep coming back to. And so my stepson is a great kid. Like he doesn't do all the normal teenage like rebellion stuff. Like he just made over 100, probably almost 150 cookies yesterday for his football banquet tonight. So like he's
Aw.
just a great kid. But sometimes he's a great kid who does some stupid stuff, right? Because that's what kids do and they're learning. I think one of the things when I think about co-parenting with a first responder, this is the thing that impacts our family the most is, my husband has unfortunately dealt with some kids in the community that aren't the best, right? Like that's what police officers do. They unfortunately oftentimes see the worst of the worst in humanity.
Mhm.
So he's dealt with some teenagers in our community that are not awesome. I think because of that, because of his job, it oftentimes how that kind of comes into play in our house is like when Zach does something as a teenager that maybe we need to redirect or we need to talk about or we maybe even need some consequences for, it oftentimes gets to a point where like my husband thinks, and we've had conversations about this, he's not those kids.
Mm-hmm.
He's not those kids that I see in the community on a regular basis when I'm at work. So if he's not those kids, then it's okay. We're just gonna let it slide a little bit. Maybe we won't hold Zach responsible for his actions as much. Maybe we won't incorporate consequences as much. And I think for me as a co-parenting mom, again, and stepmom on top of that, I think that's where a lot of frustrations come in for me. Like, no, he's not that kid that you just had to arrest in the community. You're right, but he's our kid and he still needs consequences for his actions. So how do we do that? And I think that for me, again, kind of the overarching that I've seen where my husband's job really has impacted parenting and co-parenting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
So
super
that's
cool.
hard because you're dealing with such extremes in that stuff
Mhm.
too. Yeah.
For sure. And I think from law enforcement perspective, it can be opposite. Like I remember listening to both
I
of
was
you.
just about to say
Yeah.
that.
Like, sometimes it's the opposite. Like because they work with some pretty hard kids in the community, they don't want you to be that kid. So they're even more strict on you.
I
There's
think
me
that
like,
was
Dad, are
more
you
my
listening?
experience. Yeah,
Yeah.
Listening,
that's
Dad?
more my experience for sure.
So I remember listening to you both saying that. And I'm like, gosh, that isn't what's happening in our house. That like, and I wouldn't want that to happen in our house, but God, if we could just get a little piece of that, that would be great.
It's all about that balance, right?
Yeah.
It
Like you
is.
have to find that middle ground. You don't want to be
Yeah.
too extreme on one end or the other with that.
Well, and I don't want to speak for this situation by any means, but I do think sometimes it's hard when you work with certain, like seeing kids out in the community and knowing like they just need a loving adult.
Mhm.
And so to go home and just, well, that's what I want to be is just this loving adult. And loving adults give consequences, but that's not very fun. And I think there was a dynamic in my family, with my parents where I think for my dad, it kind of got old being the bad cop, like with your kids. Like, why am I the one that's always having to set the punishment? And so I think, Ashlee, to your point, like it's this whole idea about balance, like finding some balance in it all. I have I don't know how to even ask this question, and it's kind of a deep question, Erin, and I want to respect your time. So, but being a mother now, and Ashlee and I are here because we're both kids of first responders.
Mhm.
When you think about, a 4-year-old and parenting and maybe kind of cliches that you see in with your first responders that you work with, what's kind of a priority for you in terms of parenting?
I think the cool thing about being a therapist is that my professional ethics and morals line up with my personal ethics and morals. I think one of the things that I do in therapy with folks that I work with, but also something that's really important to me personally and in our household is just connection.
Mm.
It's, again, we already recognize the barrier to the shift in the schedule, but it doesn't mean that we can't still connect with each other. It doesn't mean that he can't still connect with our kids, so what does that look like? And I think one of the things that, even as you were kind of describing, kind of bad cop parents for a minute, I thought of two different things that like I think are some of our newer generation of cops are experiencing more than our older generation of cop, and that's this concept of conflict avoidance.
Mm.
Like all day, every day, I have no choice other than to be in conflict, and hopefully it's safe conflict, but I have no choice other to do that. That I kind of tap out at the end of my shift. So when I get home and, maybe my spouse is, needs to talk about something really important, it kind of goes into that conflict avoidance place, which is like, I'm tapped out. I don't want to talk now. And then it often turns into, well, when do you want to talk? That, we never have time to talk about these things. We need to get these answers, all of that. So conflict avoidance, but then also this decision fatigue.
Mhm.
Again, all day, every day, I'm at work and I'm making all of these decisions and I have to do all of these things. So by the time I get home, I don't really want to decide what to do for dinner or where to go out to eat, but I also don't really have the capacity or the bandwidth to talk about, where our kid's going to go to elementary school, or, who's going to pick up Zach from football practice this weekend, things like that. So I think those two things really kind of impact that connection too.
Mhm.
And one of the things that my husband and I have kind of said, like, I'm acutely tuned into when he's tuned out, right? Like,
Mm.
I think a lot of us spouses are in general.
Of course.
Yeah.
But one of the things that, and we're pretty open and blunt in our relationship, so one of the things that we've just kind of said to each other at times, but I think it comes from a little bit more from me to him, which is like, you're not here, you're here, but you're not. So I need you to go do whatever you need to go do to get it right and then come
Mm,
back.
love that.
It's interesting that when we talk about the idea of connection, that we're actually asking you to disconnect for a little bit, get yourself right, get yourself healthy, figure out how to create some space for yourself so you can come back and connect with us. Because the time that we have with you is so limited
Mhm.
that we want that time to be
We want you
fun.
present.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, that's powerfully said, Erin. Powerfully said. Thank you for answering that weird question that I
Yeah.
asked.
I thought it was good. No, I thought it was
Yeah.
really, really good. And thank you so much for even being on here today. Like I said, we would love to have you back. I think that you cover so much. You're incredible in all facets. And so this hopefully isn't your last time being on, because I think we have a lot more things we can cover and pick your brain about. And I would love that. But I sincerely appreciate your time today and being on and sharing with When the Call Hits Home community. I think it's just going to hit a lot of spouses, and we needed to do that. We also really needed to open the door to talk about blended families. And I think that's a really big deal. And we're going to have to keep doing some more of that as well. So thank you.
Thank you. It was
Erin, it
fun.
was an absolute pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. It's good to meet you.
Awesome. All right, you guys. Well, you kind of know the deal already, that when the call hits home, Jennifer and I are always here for you. Thank you again to our guest, Erin, and we can't wait for the next episode. So thank you.